This is arguably one of the most successful interventions of all time, one of the biggest interventions the government has ever made in the financial lives of UK workers, pensions auto-enrolment.
Yes.
And you were there from the very beginning. You were one of the architects of pensions auto-enrolment in the UK.
Yes. It was successful way beyond what we'd expected. We surprised even ourselves with how successful auto-enrolment was.
Meet over half of the working world. They are the machine that powers our society, from pouring your coffee and emptying your bins, through to caring for a relative or delivering your parcels. You may see them as essential or frontline workers, or you might not see them at all. The Invisible Worker podcast explores the financial landscape of Britain's most diligent workforce. We speak to experts in policy, inclusion, and research to understand their challenges and start to figure out how we can solve them. Hi, I'm Emily. I'm the host of the Invisible Worker podcast, and I'm here today with Helen Dean CBE. Helen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Emily. Great to be here.
On today's episode, we're talking about one of the biggest interventions the government has ever made in the financial lives of UK workers, which is pensions auto-enrolment.
Yes.
And you were there from the very beginning. You were one of the architects of pensions auto-enrolment in the UK.
Yes.
And this is arguably one of the most successful interventions of all time. Because my understanding is prior to the Pensions Act in 2012, less than a third of private sector workers were saving into a pension. Whereas after 2012, that's now 3/4.
It was successful way beyond what we'd expected. We surprised even ourselves with how successful auto-enrolment was.
And I want to talk about auto-enrolment more, but I also want to talk about short-term savings, because there's another intervention that you and I have been discussing that we think has just as much potential as pension auto-enrolment. So we'll talk a little bit about sidecar savings, or kind of opt-out payroll savings, as it's also known. But kind of coming back to you, your background is fascinating because you've gone from school leaver to CBE. And I would love it if you could tell me a bit more about that. That is not your typical journey.
I grew up in a very working class area of Newcastle, grew up on a council estate and had a pretty poor education, really. Left school in the 70s when really that whole generation was a lost generation, you know. Unemployment was really high. And if you came from an area like I did, your expectations were just incredibly low. And so I left school and signed on the dole, as everybody did. I mean, that was just normal. And I got bored.
You got bored.
It's the thing that saved me. It was a Labour government at the time, and they had what I still think was an amazing policy. If you could sign on, but you could at the same time go to the local college and you could study for A-levels. You could only do it part-time. You could only study for 30 hours a week, no more than that. But as long as you kept your hours of study under a certain level, you could still sign on and claim your benefits. And I did 2 A-levels one year, passed them, and then I did 2 A-levels the next year and passed them. And that was my ticket really out of that world. I was able to go and do a degree in psychology. And from then, you know, I'd really built a sense of how unfair the world is, how unequal the world is. How opportunities are curated by the place you start from and the life that you're born into. And I had a sense that I wanted to work in an area that tried to bring a little more equality into the world. And so I decided that I wanted to join the civil service and become a civil servant and work in the department, what was then the Department of Health and Social Security, but on the social security side. Worked in local benefit offices, mainly in London. I'd come from a pretty poor background, but I'd never seen anything like the poverty I saw in the estates that I worked on in London. I had Peckham, which if anybody knows Peckham, they will know that they are very, very deprived areas. It wasn't just the level of poverty, it was the level of social isolation that people experienced. And my job was to go out and visit people in their homes, look at their claim for benefit, make sure that they were getting enough and put them right if they weren't. And then eventually I moved into a policy-making job, working alongside ministers, thinking about social policy, which had always been my passion. When I got the policy job, that was it. You know, I had found the thing that I loved more than anything. And within that job, I did the work on auto-enrolment. Then I moved over to set Nest up and eventually became the CEO of Nest and got my CBE for services to pension saving. There's nothing about my background or even my interests, really, I think, that would have predicted that my life would have taken the turn it did. It's just been a series of amazing opportunities and accidents, really, but it's been fantastic.
But incredibly circular as well, because actually that change for you was effectively a government intervention, a government policy.
It was.
That gave you the tooling to go and do something else with your life.
Yeah.
And the something else you've done is this enormous intervention in pension savings, which has affected millions of people. You know, I think at last count, nearly 23 million people hold a pension in the UK, and it wasn't that number before your involvement. My understanding is in the 80s and 90s, everybody knew that we were undersaving for retirement in the UK. And in fact, the big headline figure was pensioner poverty, and specifically single women and single men. So kind of around 96, 97, over 40% of single women who were retired were in poverty, which is pretty shocking. And a fairly high percentage of single men as well. And so Tony Blair's government made a commitment in 1997 to reform pensions. Didn't quite make the list. He was busy with the minimum wage at that point. And then kind of again in 2000.
Another brilliant intervention.
A fantastic intervention. And in 2001, Tony Blair again committed to pension reform, and kind of this time he was serious about it. And there was the 2002 Green Paper, which kind of set out the challenge. And correct me if I'm wrong, that then described the need to create an independent commission. So the Pension Commission, aka the Turner Commission, was set up in 2002, 2003 time. And they put out two reports. The first one was the problem statement, kind of, you know, what's not working. And kind of a year later, they put out what they think we should do about it. And kind of in between the problem and the solution, there was some work you were doing around these informed choice pilots. Is that right?
At the same time as the Pension Commission were working, I was looking at this idea of informed choice. And the Pension Commission were very, very interested in the work that I was doing on informed choice. So we sort of came together and started sharing information.
I'm going to get more into informed choice in a minute, but kind of where everything came out the other side was this idea that the answer was to automatically enroll people into pension.
Yes.
And I want to talk about what that means, because I think that's actually really misunderstood what automatic enrolment means.
Automatic enrolment works simply by switching the default. So if you do nothing, you're in. You can still choose to come out, but if you do nothing, you're in unless you actively choose not to be in a pension. Automatic enrolment works in a situation where people really want to do something, but find it hard to actually make the decision to act on that desire. And what we found with pensions was the vast majority of people who weren't saving into a pension knew that they should, to the extent that they were worrying about it, but actually making the decision to do it, to start, which pension provider to use, how much to save. It's just overwhelmingly complex and difficult and really, really hard for people to actually make the push and do it. And in those sorts of situations where you're going with the grain of what people want, automatic enrolment works extraordinarily well because people feel enabled by it.
But I remember pension auto-enrollment coming in.
Yeah.
You know, Pensions Act 2008 off of the back of the Turner Commission.
Yes.
And then kind of 1st October 2012, the first cohort began enrolling. And then as at 2018, everybody's in now. And sort of since then, contributions have been creeping up over time, which gets us to where we are now, which is nearly 23 million people with a private pension in the UK. And one of the things I found really fascinating in the Turner Commission, kind of the report from that pension commission, was this idea that 0.5% of the population acted in a way that was economically rational, as in did the thing that kind of economic theory said you should be doing. So 99.5% of us don't act
in a way that's economically rational. We don't do the things that we know we ought to be doing, or again, that kind of models predict should be happening.
Yeah, and if you think about it, I mean, I don't know about you, Emily, but I don't behave like an economically rational person. I'm very conscious that, I'm the sort of person who signs up for something like a gym membership and then never quite gets around to changing it, and never quite get round to changing my utility provider in a way that I should. There are lots of things that I think I really should do, but I just never quite get round to doing them. It's not to do with education levels or intelligence levels or occupation. That phenomenon that most people don't spend all their time thinking about money is just common to the human experience. So we're all like that.
I wonder if it's a particularly British thing, because I grew up in Canada and I grew up in a household that talked about money to the extent that when I go home, my dad will be like, well, how much do you make now? And friends will ask that question too, which you would never ask your friends here. I remember even as a child being told that I was going to learn to save and invest money for a pension, for retirement. So at the age of 13, I was, doing part-time babysitting gigs and writing checks to my mutual fund to save for the future. I'm probably in that 0.5% who is economically rational and was thinking about these things back in the time.
But when you describe the household you grew up in, and the way your father was, that feels almost like compulsion or auto-enrollment. Your father sits you down and says, here's what you're going to do. You're going to save in a pension. In a way, that's rather like the state saying, look, everybody, this is in your best interest. This is the right thing to do. You can kick against it. You don't have to do it. But really, you ought to.
Yes. So maybe it was the Trant household auto-enrollment program that I was enrolled in. I really want to talk about, in particular, the informed choice pilots. I'm going to make a strange analogy for you. In the musical Hamilton, there's this phenomenal song called The Room Where It Happens. And it's all about a very small number of change makers being in the room, making big decisions that affect the entire nation, the structure of the nation. I would argue it's Hamilton's best song, in my opinion. I'm going to give you a line from it. No one really knows how the game is played, the art of the trade, how the sausage gets made. We just assume that it happens, but no one else is in the room where it happens. And Helen, you were in the room where it happened, right? And so tell me a bit more about these informed choice pilots, because they unlocked auto-enrollment.
We set them up because the UK Treasury is a very rational place. It's full of rational economists.
Well, full of the 99 or the 0.5%.
Yeah, full of them. And they had a belief that pensions undersaving is the problem. The solution would be some kind of advice or information. Find the right calibration of advice and information, and we will be able to persuade people to save, because people are fundamentally rational. So the idea was that we would take legislative powers to enable us to require employers to offer advice or information in the workplace. And we took the primary legislation, got the primary legislation through, and my job was to do the regulations that would sit under it. So how's this going to work in practice? And I said, I don't think I can write these regulations because I don't know what works. And if we do the wrong thing, we're in danger of wasting a lot of money. And that will be quite a burden on business. So why don't we run some pilots, try and find out what kind of advice or information actually works. And then when we put the legislation through, we'll know that we're doing something that's worthwhile. Everybody agreed that was a good idea. So I went out to the industry, who were really helpful. So got hold of some financial advisors who offered us their services, got hold of a lot of employers, and we ran some pilots that we called Informed Choice. And what we were doing was we were looking at different kinds of advice and information to see what would work. So we went from handing out a leaflet to running a seminar with lots of people sitting around to one-to-one focused sessions where an individual was getting something very bespoke for them.
So it's quite a light touch intervention through to something quite high touch.
Obviously, we ran loads of pilots and We got all of the results in, and out of the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people we included in the pilot, I think 2 people took out a pension. Many people said they would, and almost everybody enjoyed the sessions and said they were useful, and everybody came out feeling very inspired and said, yeah, I'm going to take out a pension, but they didn't. And at the same time, I'd been looking hard at some of the research in America, and they were concluding advice and information doesn't work in this environment. By this time, the Pensions Commission had got to the point where they thought, we've either got to have a voluntary agenda, but we've got to find something that works, so we're going to have compulsion like they have in Australia, where people are effectively, forced to save in a pension. And we looked at our pilots and concluded that voluntarism wasn't effective. We tried everything and nothing worked. Compulsion wasn't politically acceptable. Famously, Gordon Brown and Tony Blair often disagreed that compulsory pension saving was not a place they wanted to go to. That was not going to be something that would be politically acceptable to them. So we were stuck.
Yeah, you didn't have an answer.
And it was at that stage that we found the work of Professor David Leibson at Harvard University, who was investigating this thing called auto-enrollment into 401k plans, which are American pensions. And what he found was simply by switching the default, so if you do nothing, you're in, unless you actively choose not to be in a pension. By doing that, he found that he was really increasing the level of participation in pension saving. I mean, he was getting it up to around about 80%, so pretty high. Not quite as high as compulsion, but really very, very powerful. And so, I think for me, it was like a light bulb moment. When you just think, oh, that's it. That's obviously the answer. The evidence was really limited. All we had was the evidence from the US, so a different sort of vehicle in a different place, and all of the employers were volunteers. There was no compulsion on the employer involved at all. So to do what we did was a radical, bold and brave thing. We took that idea and tried it over here. But it just felt like we had to try it, because if that didn't work, if auto-enrollment didn't work, the only place left for us to go was compulsion. There would simply be nowhere else to go.
So your work on these informed choice pilots gave the Pension Commission the evidence to say it's just not going to work to try and teach people or give them education or ask them to opt in. So you found this genius middle ground, which is just fantastic. And so coming back to what's next, the whole thing moved actually really at speed, given what a big program of work it was. And so your next job, kind of the next room you were in, is you were tasked with actually building the delivery authority, making it happen.
Auto-enrollment solves the demand side problem.
Yeah.
So that's great. So we believed that we had the answer to the fact that people weren't taking out pensions. And we decided we would legislate for that. So it would be compulsory on employers, but workers would have a choice through auto-enrollment whether they saved or not. The next thing was deciding to require an employer contribution. That was the next big and difficult thing we had to do. And we did a lot of work to demonstrate that inertia is very, very powerful. If you're going to use something like that, then you have to be very clear that saving is going to be in their financial interest. And the employer contribution is a key part of that. So when somebody puts their own money in, with the employer contribution and the tax relief, effectively they more or less double their contribution. And because of that contingent additional contribution from the employer, we got ourselves comfortable that it was ethical and right to be auto-enrolling people, because we were very comfortable that they would benefit. But we had to persuade a lot of people, including the politicians, that that was the right thing to do. And then after that, then we realised, okay, we've solved the demand side problem. We've got ourselves comfortable that it's right and people will be saving in their own interests. Then we realised there was a supply side problem. You can put this requirement on people to save into a pension, and you can put a requirement on employers to find a pension scheme, but many small employers, particularly those employing lower earners, couldn't find a pension scheme that was of reasonable quality at a low cost. Some of them just couldn't find any pension scheme at all. I mean, I saw employers who'd just been turned down by provider after provider after provider because they weren't economically attractive to them. So then we realised, oh my goodness, if we're going to put this legislation in, we're going to have to make sure that there is a fund available for people to go into. We'll have to create a pension scheme.
Yeah.
And so that's why the National Pension Scheme, which became Nest, was set up. And that was the thing I went to go and deliver.
Okay, Helen, I want to talk about the personal impact of having a pension. What are some of the stories that you've heard over the years from people whose lives you've changed through auto-enrolment?
It's really wonderful to hear what some people tell you about what it feels like. And I can think of loads of them, but the one that always really sticks in my mind is at Nest, one of the things that we're doing is getting people to take a bit more interest in their pension. And the way we do that is we're running a campaign called Everyday Investors.
Mm-hmm.
And what we do is we find ways of talking to people about what is this thing called investment? Where does the money go? How does that work? So, for example, we own a huge stake in the Hornsey wind farm just offshore Grimsby. That wind farm has had a huge positive impact on the area. Regeneration of the Grimsby docks, loads of jobs in the wind farm, even the fishermen benefit because the boats that you use to go out to the wind farm are leased from the local fishermen. So it's been really positive for the area. So we took a bunch of Nest members who live in Grimsby and we stuck them in a boat and we took them out to the wind farm and we said, there you go, you own that.
Wow.
And their reaction, which we obviously videoed, is just phenomenal. We're now looking at other things to try and connect people with the reality of what they're doing with their pension. If you look at things like the work that Make My Money Matter are doing, where they're trying to get people to understand, if you're interested in the environment, the single biggest thing you can do is put some pressure on your pension provider to behave ethically and invest responsibly.
In my line of work, one of the things I see and I say is that engagement creates engagement, and getting people to start to engage with their money creates really positive, life-changing money habits in different walks of life.
Yeah.
You know, feeling like you're part of it and you can participate and the decisions you make matter. I think that's incredibly powerful, that feeling of I'm part of this, I'm part of this ecosystem.
Yeah.
I want to take that and I want to talk about short-term savings now, because pensions, you know, we're in a good spot, right? We've reduced pensioner poverty. We've massively ramped up participation. As you say, people are waking up to the idea that your pension, what you're doing with your money, is the number one thing you can do for the environment. But I want to talk about short-term savings because that's sort of the next crisis. That's the next thing that needs a big intervention.
Indeed, it does.
And there is a stat that the Money and Pension Service put out probably close to 2 years ago, saying that 25% of UK adults have £100 or less saved. And in fact, for 17%, that's nothing. And every time I tell people this, first of all, they presume initially that I'm speaking about a particular component of the workforce. They presume I'm talking about people kind of doing low and variable paid jobs. And I say, no, everybody. 25% of all adults have less than £100 saved. And it's shocking. It's completely shocking. And when you drill deeper into kind of the world of work that I'm particularly interested in, people who have volatility in their earnings, the volatility that we see month to month, it's around 37 hours average volatility in hours worked if you're on an hourly paid job, which adds up to around £400 of volatility.
Yeah.
So how are you supposed to get on with life if you've got £400 of volatility, but you don't have £100 in the bank?
Yeah.
So that's the next big problem to solve.
I totally agree.
And we've been working on it.
We have indeed.
A little bit. So
and we have the answer.
Yeah.
We do.
And so in your role as a CEO of Nest, you've also managed to create Nest Insights. which is a kind of a research body looking to kind of tackle and solve some of the challenges facing society. And since 2017, the team at Nest Insights have been researching what they call sidecar savings. Can you talk to me about sidecar savings?
The same brilliant academic at Harvard University, Professor David Leibson, having given us the idea for auto-enrollment, many years later started looking at sidecar savings. So the idea with sidecar savings is, as you say, it's absolutely essential that people start to build up short-term emergency savings. It's important for the individual because if they don't have some kind of financial resilience, then they're not able to sustain even short-term financial shocks, even fairly small financial shocks, like an unexpected bill coming in. It's very easy in that scenario to suddenly find yourself spiraling into a debt problem. But even if you look at it from a pension point of view, the biggest determinant of your pension outcome, it's not your charges and it's not your investment returns. The biggest determinant on your pension outcome is your ability to save persistently over a long period of time. And the biggest thing that prevents that is you have to stop because something happens, a financial shock happens, that means you have to stop saving. So even looked at from a pensions point of view, it's essential that people have some short-term resilience. So David Leibson, knowing this to be the case, wanted to find a way of addressing that, but a way of addressing that avoided people taking money out of their pension. Taking money out of your pension is a very bad thing. It's administratively expensive. It means you can't invest in the long term and you lose out on all sorts of investment opportunities. So instead of borrowing from your pension, he came up with the idea of a sidecar. So the idea is you're auto-enrolled into your pension. At the same time, some more money is taken and put into a sidecar short-term liquid savings product. That product builds and builds and builds, and when it reaches a certain level, it can tip into the pension. So it's effectively a feeder for the pension. If some money's taken out, then it goes back again, starts building again. So people always have some short-term financial resilience. That was David Leibson's idea. And at Nest, we became really gripped by that idea. Auto-enrollment is really powerful. We had seen, even during the cost of living crisis that people were facing, we saw that people were not stopping saving for retirement. On the whole, people just carried on saving. And we did become concerned that those people needed some short-term financial resilience. Our members at Nest, who are the lower earners in society, we decided to start trying it out, and we started working with yourselves, and we found a bunch of employers who were willing to work with us, and we looked at sidecar savings on an opt-in basis and on an opt-out basis. We found it's just like auto-enrollment all over again.
It really does feel like history repeating itself.
It really does. So you ask people and they'll tell you, I think about half of people will say, that's a great idea, I'd really like one of those. On an opt-in basis, about 1% of people pick it up. On an opt-out basis, as many as 71% of people will take it up. So the impact is phenomenal. So it's a very short leap from the results of those trials, which are spectacularly successful, show that opt-out emergency savings works. The people who are in the trials love it. And the employers also report very positive impacts from an employment point of view in terms of the workforce. It's a really short leap from there to thinking, why don't we extend the auto-enrollment policy to include sidecar savings so that instead of just ratcheting up the amount that people are contributing to their pension, which is what a lot of people are calling for, why don't we do that via a sidecar? And that way people can build up short-term emergency savings alongside their pension.
And because ratcheting it up on its own can feel a bit scary. It can feel like you're beginning to increase how much money is locked away for the longer term.
Exactly.
And it's hard to keep that economically rational focus on the long term when short-term things are much more pressing. And so having that liquidity, that short-term liquidity is incredibly powerful.
And to be honest, Emily, for many people, it's not even economically rational. It's probably not economically rational to save more for the long term if you're really struggling in the short term and you're going to end up with, expensive debt. It probably does make more sense to save for the short term. So it's about helping people to do the right thing for themselves, and particularly for lower earners, it's really, really important to do that. Or people with volatile earnings, it helps them smooth their earnings over periods of time.
I was reflecting, so I knew we were, coming in to chat about this today, and I was reflecting, I wish we'd had this a decade ago. I remember working, again, for a tiny startup that didn't have any occupational pension, and I was investing privately in my own pension with a financial advisor, and then having kids. And the advice my advisor gave me at the time was, you should stop investing in your pension because you're about to go on mat leave on statutory pay, which at the time was like £148 a week. You can't live on £148 a week. And he said, conserve your cash because you're about to enter a cash burn period of your life, which was true, where I had sort of 2 kids in fairly quick succession and a solid 5 years of not putting any money into my pension because that was the rational thing to do, right? Which was pause those contributions, be more liquid, be able to pay for that period of mat leave, and then be able to pay for nursery fees and all the increased costs of having kids on going back to work. But I wish there'd been something like sidecar savings back then, because I would have had the confidence to keep saving, knowing that I still had access to some of that liquidity, and I would be in a better position in my pension. I wouldn't have that 5-year gap pension savings that kind of I've now got, which makes a big difference over the long run.
It makes a huge difference. And it is completely incomprehensible to me why this wouldn't be the right thing to do, because we have so much more evidence for this than we had for pensions auto-enrolment. If I go back to what I was saying before, for pensions auto-enrolment, we had some evidence which was in the States for a different product, completely different culture, and all done on a voluntary basis from the employer's point of view. And yet we took that and we took a punt. We took a gamble, really.
Quite a big punt.
Quite a big change to do on that level of evidence. With sidecar, what we have is really robust, statistically significant evidence that shows us that in the workplace, in the UK, this works. It works positively, it's well received by workers, and it's well received by employers. Why wouldn't you do it?
Yeah. And in my day job at WageStream, so we've been facilitating some of this research with an opt-out approach to savings. And within 4 months, the average balance is over £100.
Yeah, fabulous.
And within 8 months, the average balance is over £200. Yeah. And so you're really quickly moving people beyond those thresholds of not having £100 to their name. And we consistently get feedback about how much people enjoy savings, how good they feel about savings, and how they didn't think they could afford to save. And actually, that was my opinion way, way back when we started on this journey, when we were talking about workplace savings, and this is a solution, is to help people save more. And I thought, well, that's silly. If people don't have the money, they don't have the money. But it's just not true. And there's something around the behavioral economics of, if it comes off your pay before it hits your bank account, you actually don't notice it. You don't feel that loss as acutely.
Yes.
Whereas if it hit your bank account and then you've got to move it somewhere else, that hurts. If you never see it in the first place, you almost don't notice it.
You're absolutely right. Psychological benefits of saving
and
the psychological benefits of feeling that you have some resilience are enormous. I mean, I can remember personally the moment, I'd never had anything. I'd never had any savings at all. I'd lived hand to mouth, and then an aunt of my mum's died, and she left my mum £1,000, and my mum gave £500 to me, £500 to my brother. My brother went and spent his, and I put mine away into premium bonds. And that £500 is still in the premium bonds. I've never taken it out. But there's something about that feeling of security. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had some security, and that if anything happened, I would have something behind me. And the psychological benefit of that is phenomenal. And people don't really want to give that up easily. Once they start to feel that, they don't want to give it up. That's why once people are in these savings patterns, either for pensions or for sidecar savings, they don't want to stop. Because actually, it's a great feeling to feel that you have some financial security when you've never had it in your life before.
So does this feel like something we can get political momentum behind? As you say, there's more evidence for sidecar savings, kind of for opt-out payroll savings, than there ever was for pension auto-enrollment. What needs to happen to make this a reality?
The most important thing, the thing that really made pension saving work in an enduring way was the fact that it was as non-political as possible.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that the Pensions Commission recommended it,
Mm-hmm.
the fact that we spent a year building a consensus, every political party got involved, every political party supported it. And it meant that when the Labour government was replaced by the coalition government,
Mm-hmm.
they were already signed up to the policy of auto-enrolment. They did do a review, but they were already fundamentally signed up to the principles. And then the coalition government was replaced by a Conservative government. Every political party has played a part in pension auto-enrolment, and therefore it's very, very deeply driven into the psyche of the politics of this country. I think it's essential that we do it, but I think it's essential that it's done in a way that brings all political parties along on the journey, and the employer community have to come along on the journey as well, and we have to know that people will accept it. So we've done it once, we could do it again.
We've got the blueprint for it.
We've got the blueprint for it.
Okay, Helen, I want to come to a topic that's a bit of a favourite of mine. Education versus intervention. Okay, so the Turner Commission suggested that only 0.5% of the population behave in a way that's economically rational. So we don't make good choices for ourselves. The informed choice pilots that you ran, you reached hundreds of people. You got 2 opening up a pension. And the early savings research trials, the early sidecar savings trials about workplace short-term savings had about a 1% conversion rate. And then we flipped the default and we lifted participation by over 50 percentage points. So why do we keep coming to education as the answer? And I'm going to quote Helen Dean to Helen Dean. I heard you say you would not go to the doctor and be expected to be medically literate. You just need to know what's wrong and what to get help with. Why are we expecting people to be financially literate?
Yeah, it's beyond me. People have more important things to do with their lives. You know, they want to get on with their hobbies. They want to get on with doing their cycling or going to the theatre or going to watch Hamilton. Most people, apart from the 0.5% of people who love that sort of thing, most people don't want to spend their time thinking about those sorts of things in that level of detail. What they need to be is they need to be reasonable customers of a service. They don't need to be expert. And the attempt to try and make everybody an expert in finance, I just think is crazy. Why would you want to do that? People can be very astute and they could be good financial managers, but they don't have to be financial experts. You need to learn to drive the car. You need to understand how to use the gears and press the pedals and steer. You don't need to understand the workings of an internal combustion engine.
Mm-hmm.
That gets done for you. And people need to be equipped enough to be able to drive.
Yeah.
You know, drive their own car, deal with the pensions industry.
You've got to know the rules of the road.
Yeah, exactly. You've got to know the rules of the road, but you do not need to be a mechanic.
I think that's a great note to wrap up on. And I'm going to ask you for a closing thought. So here on the Invisible Worker podcast, we're exploring the financial lives of the working majority. So typically people who are in kind of frontline or essential work. And you coming from, as I said, you know, school leaver to CBE, you've met thousands of people who do kind of some of the lowest paid work in Britain, especially through Nest, where you serve the masses. What is the insight that you have on kind of the typical British worker that you wish more people knew?
How incredibly financially savvy people on low earnings are. My parents, for example, were probably the most financially able people ever because they made low earnings stretch to feed us and clothe us and buy us Christmas presents. If you're on low earnings, every penny counts. You really understand where every penny is. And there is sometimes a tendency to think that people who are lower earners aren't as financially astute as people who have more money. In my experience, the exact opposite is true. And therefore, when you create interventions that help people who are already pretty money conscious manage their money better, they will go with you and they will embrace it because they are already much more financial savvy than most people in the country, certainly than most higher earners are.
Brilliant. I love that. Thank you very much. It's been Helen Dean on the Invisible Worker podcast.
Thank you, Emily.
Before you go, make sure you stay in touch. Please subscribe to the Invisible Worker podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you go to listen. That way you can follow along as we release new episodes. Thanks again, and see you soon.